Man alone broke the native girl's only rule and saved the village from the fire no one saw coming. The smoke should not have been there. Thomas McKenna squinted through the haze drifting across the valley, his weathered hands gripping the reins of his black stallion. 3 days of riding through the New Mexico territory had brought him to this sacred ground, and now something was desperately wrong. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Red Canyon walls, but the gray wisps rising from the forest below moved against the wind, carrying a smell that made his horse stamp nervously. He had come here for one reason, to find the woman who refused to speak to any white man, the woman whose people whispered she could read the earth's secrets like scripture, the woman whose village had something he needed more than his next breath. But first, he had to survive breaking her most sacred rule. The descent into the canyon took 40 minutes of careful navigation down ancient pathways carved into the stone. Thomas had spent 18 years as a scout for the cavalry, then another 20 working cattle drives across the Southwest. He knew how to read terrain, how to sense danger in the wind. Yet nothing had prepared him for the way this place seemed to watch him. At 38, Thomas carried scars from Apache arrows, burns from stampeding cattle, and a limp from a horse that threw him in Colorado. His sun-darkened skin bore the map of a hard life spent under open skies. Gray streaked his black hair, and deep lines etched the corners of his green eyes. He wore practical leather boots, dark wool pants, and a cotton shirt that had seen better days. His gun belt held a single Colt revolver, clean but well used. The village appeared gradually through the cottonwood trees. Adobe buildings with flat roofs clustered around a central plaza where women ground corn and children played with wooden toys. Men worked on hunting equipment and tended horses in corrals built from juniper posts. The settlement breathed with the quiet rhythm of people who had lived on this land for generations. Thomas dismounted near a grove of ancient oaks, their trunks thick enough that 3 men could not wrap their arms around them. The silence felt heavy, expectant. No one approached him, but he sensed eyes watching from doorways and windows. He had expected hostility, suspicion at the very least. Instead, he found something harder to navigate, patient indifference. She emerged from the largest building like sunrise breaking over mountains. The woman moved with fluid grace across the packed earth plaza, her long black hair catching light with each step. She wore a dress of soft deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork in blues and whites that told stories Thomas could not read. Silver bracelets circled her wrists, and turquoise earrings framed her face. At 20, she possessed the kind of natural beauty that made men forget their purpose. But it was her eyes that stopped him completely. Dark as obsidian, they held depths of knowledge that seemed impossible in someone so young. When she looked at him, Thomas felt measured, evaluated, and found distinctly lacking. She spoke in her native tongue to an elderly man who appeared beside her. The conversation was brief, musical, and entirely excluding Thomas from its meaning. Then she turned those unfathomable eyes back to him and waited. "My name is Thomas McKenna," he said, removing his hat. "I rode here from Santa Fe." She said nothing. "I need to speak with you about something important, something that affects both our peoples." Still nothing. The elderly man stepped forward and spoke in heavily accented English. "Ayanna does not speak with white men. This is her way. You must go." Thomas had expected this. For 3 months, he had heard the same story from traders, cavalry officers, and territorial officials. The woman called Ayanna had never broken her rule. Not for government agents offering money. Not for military commanders making threats. Not for missionaries promising salvation. "I understand her position," Thomas said carefully, "but I have information about a danger coming to this region. A danger that will affect everyone living in these canyons." The elderly man translated. Ayanna listened without expression, then replied in their language. Her voice carried authority despite her youth. "She says if the white man's danger comes, the earth will warn her. The spirits will guide her people. You have no words she needs to hear." Thomas felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He had ridden 3 days on little sleep and less food to get here. The information burning in his saddlebags could not wait for diplomatic protocol or cultural sensitivities. "Tell her about the railroad," he said. Something flickered across Ayana's face. Not surprise, exactly, but recognition. The elderly man spoke again, and her response came faster this time. "She knows about the Iron Horse Road. The white men have been cutting trees and blasting stone for many weeks. Tell her they found something while digging. Something that will bring more white men than she has ever seen. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands." This time Ayana spoke directly to Thomas, her voice sharp with words he could not understand, but whose meaning rang clear. She wanted him gone. The elderly man looked uncomfortable. "She says you speak lies to create fear. The railroad men work slowly. They are few, and they stay far from our valley." Thomas opened his saddlebag and withdrew a folded newspaper from Santa Fe, 3 days old. The headline read in bold type, "Major silver strike discovered near Canyon Country." Below it, a smaller heading promised, "Territory officials expect mining boom to begin immediately." He held the paper toward Ayana, pointing at the headline. She glanced at it briefly, then looked away with deliberate dismissal. "She cannot read the white man's markings," the elderly man said. "But you can," Thomas said. "Read it to her." The old man took the paper reluctantly. As he read, his weathered face grew grave. He spoke to Ayana in urgent tones, gesturing toward the mountains surrounding their canyon. Her calm demeanor began to crack. Thomas pressed his advantage. "The silver vein runs directly under your valley. According to the survey reports, it is the richest strike found in the territory in 20 years. There will be mining camps within 6 months. The railroad will bring equipment and workers. Your water sources will be diverted. Your hunting grounds will be destroyed." Ayana spoke rapidly to the elder, her composure finally breaking. He answered with equal intensity. Other villagers had begun gathering in the plaza, sensing the tension in their conversation. "She asks why you bring this news," the old man said. "What do you gain from warning us?" Thomas had hoped to avoid this question. The truth was complicated, tied to his own failures and desperate circumstances. But standing in the shadow of those ancient oaks, watching Ayana's face reflect growing alarm, he decided on honesty. "Because I own land adjacent to your valley," he said, "and because the mining company wants to force me out too. They made me an offer that would barely cover my debts. When I refused, they made it clear the offer would not be repeated." The elder translated. Ayana's eyes narrowed as she studied Thomas with new interest. "She says you seek allies in a white man's war." "I seek justice," Thomas replied. "And I believe she does too." For the first time, Ayana addressed him directly in English. Her voice carried a slight accent but perfect clarity. "You would have me break my sacred vow for your convenience." Thomas felt his heart skip. Her English was flawless, educated, suggesting schooling he had not expected. "You speak English. I speak 5 languages. I read Latin and Greek. I studied at the mission school in Albuquerque until I was 16. None of this changes my vow." "Then why make such a vow?" Her dark eyes flashed with anger. "Because every white man who has spoken to me has lied. Every promise made to my people has been broken. Every treaty signed has been violated. Words from white men bring only destruction." Thomas absorbed this quietly. Around them, the village continued its morning activities, but he sensed an undercurrent of anxiety spreading through the community. "What if I could prove the danger is real?" he asked. "What if I could show you something that would convince you my words are true?" Ayana studied him for a long moment. "There is nothing you could show me that would matter." "What about the smoke?" She frowned. "What smoke?" Thomas pointed toward the forest on the eastern rim of the canyon. The gray wisps he had noticed earlier had thickened into distinct columns rising above the tree line. That smoke, moving against the wind, coming from the direction of the railroad construction. Ayanna followed his gaze, her frown deepening. She spoke quickly to the elder, who shaded his eyes and looked toward the mountains. The old one says it could be campfires from hunting parties, she said. Hunting parties do not make smoke that thick, Thomas replied, and they do not make it in 3 separate locations at once. As they watched, a 4th column of smoke appeared further north, then a 5th. The wind carried no sound of voices or axes, only an ominous crackling that seemed to grow stronger by the minute. Ayanna said something sharp to the elder, who immediately called out to other men in the village. Within moments, 3 young warriors had climbed the canyon wall to investigate. Thomas watched them disappear over the rim with practiced stealth. How long until they return? He asked. 2 hours, Ayanna said. Maybe less if they find trouble. We may not have 2 hours. As if summoned by his words, a new smell reached them on the shifting wind. Not the clean scent of campfire smoke or cooking fires, something acrid, chemical, wrong. Thomas recognized it immediately from his cavalry days. That is black powder, he said. Someone is blasting with explosives. Ayanna went rigid. The mining crews? Has to be. But they are supposed to be working 20 miles north of here. Either they lied about their location or something has accelerated their timeline. The elderly man approached them, speaking urgently to Ayanna. She listened, then turned to Thomas with obvious reluctance. Gray Wolf says the smoke grows thicker. The wind brings strange sounds from the east. He asks if you have knowledge of what this means. Thomas looked at the expanding smoke columns, now clearly visible against the morning sky. His military experience told him exactly what it meant, and the knowledge sat like lead in his stomach. It means they are clearing forest with fire and explosives, preparing the ground for heavy equipment. If they are working this close to your canyon, they plan to start mining operations immediately. But the surveys, Ayanna said, they told the territorial governor that mineral exploration would take months. They lied. The silver assay results must have exceeded their expectations. They are moving as fast as possible to establish claims before other companies arrive. A young warrior appeared at the canyon rim, waving his arms and shouting down to the village. His words carried panic even without translation. Ayanna went pale. Little Bear says the fire moves toward the canyon. The forest burns in 3 directions. The white men have built a road through the heart of our hunting grounds. Thomas felt his worst fears confirmed. The mining company was not just beginning operations early. They were deliberately destroying the forest to drive out the Native Americans and clear the way for unrestricted access to the mineral deposits. How many people live in this village? He asked. 73, Ayanna replied, including children and elders. How many horses? Perhaps 20 that could carry riders. Half that number suitable for long distances. Thomas calculated rapidly. 73 people, maybe 30 horses, facing a forest fire that could trap them in a canyon with limited exits. The situation was becoming desperate. Another shout from the rim brought more bad news. The warrior pointed south, where new smoke columns had appeared. The fire was spreading faster than seemed natural. They are using accelerants, Thomas said grimly. Probably kerosene or coal oil. This is not accidental burning. This is systematic destruction. Ayanna stared at the growing smoke, her composure finally cracking completely. Why would they burn the forest? The trees have value. The lumber could be sold. Because burned land is easier to claim, fewer legal challenges. And because driving you out eliminates potential resistance to their operations. The truth hung between them like a blade. The mining company was not simply extracting minerals. They were waging war on the people who stood in their way. Gray Wolf approached them again, speaking rapidly and pointing toward different parts of the canyon rim. Thomas could see smoke rising from multiple directions now, forming an irregular circle around their position. He says the fire surrounds us on 3 sides, Ayana translated. The only clear path leads west toward the desert, but that route has no water for 30 miles. Thomas studied the terrain, his military training taking over. The canyon offered some protection from fire, but it also created a natural trap. If the flames reached the rim and began burning down the walls, everyone below would be caught with no escape routes. How long to evacuate everyone? He asked. With children and elderly? 4 hours to reach safety, maybe 5. We do not have 4 hours. As if to emphasize his point, a new sound reached them from the east, the deep rumble of heavy machinery. Thomas recognized the distinctive noise of steam-powered equipment being transported over rough terrain. Steam tractors, he said. They are bringing in mining equipment ahead of the railroad. This operation is bigger than anyone anticipated. Ayana closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, Thomas saw a decision crystallizing in their depths. If I break my vow, she said quietly, if I work with you to save my people, what guarantee do I have that you will not betray us once the danger passes? Thomas considered the question seriously. In her position, he would demand the same assurance. But what could he offer that would mean anything? Words were what she distrusted most. None, he said finally. You have no guarantee except my word. And I understand why that means nothing to you. The honesty seemed to surprise her. Then why should I trust you? Because right now, I am the only white man trying to warn you instead of destroy you. And because we are running out of time to argue about it. The sound of machinery grew louder. Through the trees, Thomas could see movement on the eastern canyon rim. Men with surveying equipment were positioning themselves at various points, clearly mapping the area for immediate development. Ayana spoke rapidly to Gray Wolf, who nodded and hurried away. Within minutes, the plaza filled with villagers gathering possessions and preparing children for travel. I have given the evacuation order, she said, but you are right about time. We need another solution. Thomas studied the approaching smoke, the terrain, and the limited resources available. A desperate plan began forming in his mind. Dangerous, with little chance of success, but possibly their only option. What if we do not run? He said. What do you mean? What if we fight the fire instead of fleeing from it? Ayana stared at him. Fight a forest fire with 70 people and hand tools? That is madness. Not the whole fire. Just enough of it to create a firebreak around the village. Your people know this land better than anyone. They know where the water sources are, which plants burn fastest, how the wind patterns work in these canyons. You propose to battle white man's destruction with native knowledge. I propose we save your village by combining what I know about military strategy with what your people know about survival. The machinery sounds grew closer. Time was running out for debate. Ayana looked toward her people, busy preparing for exodus, then at the advancing smoke, then back at Thomas. What would you need from us? Every able-bodied person. Every tool that can dig or cut. Every container that can carry water. And complete trust in a plan that will either save your village or kill us all. She was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that all seemed impossible. If we stay and fight and we fail, my people die. If you run with children and elders toward a desert without water, some of them die anyway. This at least gives everyone a chance. The truth of it settled over them both. There were no safe choices left. Ayana raised her voice and called out in her native tongue. The villagers stopped their packing and gathered around her. She spoke for several minutes, gesturing toward the smoke, toward Thomas, toward the sacred oaks that had sheltered their people for generations. When she finished, an elderly woman stepped forward and spoke firmly. Others joined in, their voices creating a complex harmony of agreement and determination. They say they will fight, Ayana translated. Not because they trust you, but because they trust me. And I have decided to break my vow. Thomas felt relief wash over him, followed immediately by the weight of responsibility. 73 lives now depended on a plan he was making up as they spoke. "First, we need to know exactly what we are fighting," he said. "I need to get to higher ground and assess the fire's direction and speed. I will come with you. Your people need you here, organizing the work parties. My people need me to verify that your assessment is accurate. I will not commit them to battle based solely on white man's judgment." "Fair enough." Thomas looked toward the canyon wall, calculating the climb. "Can you handle that ascent in a dress?" For the first time since they had met, Ayanna smiled. It transformed her face completely, revealing humor and warmth that had been hidden beneath layers of caution and anger. "White man, I have been climbing these rocks since I could walk. Worry about yourself." The climb took 20 minutes. Thomas, despite his experience with difficult terrain, found himself impressed by Ayanna's agility and sure-footedness. She moved up the steep rock face like water flowing uphill, finding handholds and footholds that seemed invisible to his eyes. At the rim, the full scope of the disaster became clear. The forest fire stretched across miles of mountainous terrain, burning in an organized pattern that confirmed Thomas's suspicions about deliberate destruction. Crews of men moved systematically through unburned areas, setting new fires and directing the blaze toward specific targets. But worse than the fire itself was what followed in its wake. "Sweet Jesus," Thomas whispered. Behind the advancing flames, a small army of workers was already beginning construction. Steam-powered equipment cleared burned timber while teams of surveyors mapped mining claims. Most shocking of all, a temporary rail line was being laid directly toward the canyon where Ayanna's people lived. "They planned this," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Every bit of it. The fires, the timing, the equipment. They knew exactly where to strike." "Look there," Thomas pointed to a cluster of tents near the eastern approach. "That is not a mining camp. Those are military-style field fortifications. They brought armed security." Ayanna studied the distant encampment. "How many men?" "Hard to say from here. At least 50. Maybe more." The implications were staggering. The mining company had not just begun operations early. They had brought a private army to ensure no resistance could develop. "We cannot fight that," Ayanna said quietly. Thomas continued studying the scene below, his mind racing through tactical possibilities. Then he saw something that changed everything. "Look at the wind patterns," he said. The smoke from the various fires was behaving strangely, creating conflicting air currents that fought against each other. In some areas, the flames moved forward aggressively. In others, they seemed to stall or even retreat. The topography is working against them, Thomas realized. These canyons create their own weather. The fires are not spreading as fast as they expected. What does that mean? It means their timeline is off. They planned for the fires to clear this entire area in one day, but the terrain is slowing the burn. That gives us leverage. Ayanna looked skeptical. "How?" Thomas pointed toward a series of ridgelines between the main fire and their canyon. "If we can create fire breaks along those natural barriers, we can redirect the burn away from your village. The wind patterns will carry the flames north toward areas that are already burned. And if we fail, then we die fighting instead of running. But if we succeed, your people keep their home and the mining company loses months of work." They made their way back down the canyon wall with new urgency. At the bottom, Grey Wolf and the other village leaders waited for their report. Ayanna spoke rapidly in her native tongue, describing what they had seen. The faces around her grew increasingly grim as she detailed the scope of the threat. "Tell them about the plan," Thomas said. She translated his strategy, using gestures and drawings in the dirt to illustrate the concept of controlled fire breaks. The discussion that followed was intense, with multiple voices contributing ideas and concerns. "They want to know about water," she said. "The creek that feeds our village is the only reliable source for miles. If we use it to fight fires, we risk losing it to contamination or diversion. The mining crews will divert it anyway once they establish operations. Fighting for it now at least gives us a chance to protect it. More discussion. Thomas watched the villagers' faces, seeing fear balanced against determination. These were people who had faced adversity before and survived through cooperation and ingenuity. They agreed to try, Ayanna said finally, but they want to know what role you will play. They do not understand why a white man would risk his life for our village. Thomas had been dreading this question. The complete truth was complicated, involving his own desperate financial situation and the grudge he bore against the mining company. But looking at these people preparing to trust him with their lives, he decided they deserved honesty. Because 20 years ago, I was a cavalry officer, he said. I participated in actions against native peoples that I now regret. I cannot undo that past, but I can choose differently today. The translation created a stir among the older men, some of whom bore scars that suggested their own encounters with the military. Grey Wolf asked several sharp questions. He wants to know which battles, Ayanna said. Canyon de Chelly, the Long Walk, operations in the Four Corners region. The silence that followed felt heavy with old pain and anger. Thomas waited for the judgment he probably deserved. Instead, Grey Wolf stepped forward and extended his hand. He says a man who admits his mistakes can sometimes be trusted with a second chance, Ayanna translated. But he also says if you betray us now, he will personally ensure you do not live to regret it. Thomas shook the offered hand, feeling the weight of conditional acceptance. Fair enough. The work began immediately. Using Ayanna's knowledge of local geography and Thomas's understanding of fire behavior, they divided the village into specialized teams. Water carriers would establish relay chains from the creek to key defensive positions. Diggers would create fire breaks along the ridgelines Thomas had identified. Scouts would monitor the fire's progress and report changes in wind direction. Fighters would use controlled burns to eliminate fuel ahead of the main fire. The most dangerous job went to a team of young warriors who would work closest to the advancing flames, using wet blankets and hand tools to direct the fire away from critical areas. I should be with the fighters, Ayanna said as they organized the work parties. You should coordinate from here. Your people need a central command. My people need to see that I share their risks. Thomas recognized the stubborn determination in her voice. It reminded him of officers he had known who led from the front despite the tactical disadvantages. Then we work together, he said. You handle coordination with the village teams. I take point with the advance fighters. No, we both go forward. Grey Wolf can coordinate from here. Before Thomas could argue, shouts from the canyon rim announced new developments. The advance scouts were signaling frantically, pointing toward multiple locations where the fire had changed direction. It is moving faster, Ayanna said, studying the distant smoke. The wind has shifted. Thomas felt his carefully planned timeline collapsing. They had expected at least 4 hours to prepare defenses. Now it looked like they might have 2. Change of plans, he announced. Everyone capable of hard physical work comes with us. We create one strong fire break instead of multiple weak ones. The march to the primary defensive position took 45 minutes through rough terrain. Thomas led a column of 38 villagers, carrying every tool, container, and weapon they could manage. Behind them, the remaining villagers continued evacuation preparations in case the defensive effort failed. The site Thomas had chosen was a natural saddle between two ridgelines, where centuries of erosion had created a gap barely 200 yards wide. If they could clear vegetation and create a fire break across that gap, the flames would be forced to travel around the ridgelines, adding miles to their journey and buying precious time. But first, they had to survive long enough to build it. The advance fire reached them while they were still clearing brush from the fire break line. Thomas heard it before he saw it, a low roar like distant thunder, growing steadily louder. "Everyone down to the creek," he shouted. "Soak your clothes and blankets. Stay low and keep moving." The creek running through the saddle was barely 3 feet deep, but it provided their only source of water and refuge. Thomas watched his impromptu fire crew splash into the stream, many of them looking terrified but determined. Ayanna emerged from the water with her long hair plastered against her head and her beaded dress clinging to her body. But her eyes were steady, focused on the approaching wall of flame and smoke. "How long do we have?" she asked. Thomas studied the fire's approach, calculating speed and distance. 10 minutes. Maybe 15. Is that enough time to finish the fire break? It has to be. They worked with desperate intensity, using axes, shovels, and bare hands to clear the remaining vegetation from their defensive line. The fire's roar grew louder, accompanied by the crack of exploding tree trunks and the hiss of superheated air. At 5 minutes, Thomas could feel the heat on his face despite being hundreds of yards from the flames. At 3 minutes, burning embers began falling around them like deadly snow. At 1 minute, he made the hardest decision of his life. "Everyone into the creek," he ordered. "Wet blankets over your heads. Stay underwater as much as possible." "The fire break is not finished," Ayanna protested. "It will have to be enough." They huddled in the shallow creek as the fire reached their position. The heat was overwhelming, turning the air itself into something that burned their lungs with each breath. Thomas pulled Ayanna against him, both of them covered by a soaking blanket, and felt her trembling with more than cold. The fire passed over them like a living thing, consuming everything in its path. Trees exploded into torches. Rock surfaces cracked from the heat. The very air seemed to burn. Then, gradually, the roar began to fade. Thomas raised his head cautiously and looked around. The fire break had held. Not perfectly, flames had jumped the line in several places, but well enough to fragment the main fire into smaller, manageable pieces. More importantly, the natural topography was doing exactly what he had predicted. The scattered flames were being channeled away from the village by wind patterns and terrain features, spreading north and east toward areas that were already burned. "Did we do it?" Ayanna asked, her voice hoarse from smoke. Thomas studied the burning landscape around them. Small fires still flickered in dozens of locations, but the massive wall of destruction that had threatened the village was broken and dispersing. "We bought time," he said. "Whether we save the village depends on what happens next." The next 4 hours tested everyone's endurance. Working in teams, they chased down spot fires, reinforced weak sections of the fire break, and gradually expanded their defensive perimeter. The work was hot, dangerous, and exhausting. But it was working. By late afternoon, the immediate threat to the village had passed. The main fire continued burning to the north and east, but it was no longer advancing toward their canyon. More importantly, the mining company's carefully orchestrated destruction had been disrupted. Thomas stood on a burned ridge, surveying the results of their desperate gamble. Smoke still rose from dozens of locations, but the pattern was chaotic now instead of systematic. The company's timeline was ruined. "You did it," Ayanna said, joining him on the ridge. She was covered in soot and ash, her dress torn and her hair singed, but she was smiling. "We did it," Thomas corrected. "Your people made the difference. I just suggested the strategy. My people would have run without you. The village would have been lost." Thomas nodded toward the smoke rising from the mining operations. "This is not over. They will try again. Let them try. Now we know what we are facing, and now we know we can fight back." They made their way back to the village as the sun set behind the western mountains. The people who greeted them had transformed during the day's crisis. Where Thomas had seen resignation and fear that morning, he now saw confidence and determination. The victory celebration was subdued but meaningful. Food was shared, stories were told, and plans were made for the challenges still ahead. As the evening progressed, Thomas found himself sitting beside Ayanna near the sacred oaks that had witnessed the day's events. "I broke my vow today," she said quietly. "Do you regret it?" She considered the question seriously. I regret that it was necessary, but I do not regret the choice. My people are alive because I chose to trust you, and because you chose to fight instead of flee. We chose to fight, both of us, together." The word hung between them, carrying implications that went beyond the day's battle. "The mining company will not give up," Thomas said. "They have too much invested in this operation. Then we will fight them again, and again, if necessary." "We?" Ayanna met his eyes directly. "You saved my village today. That makes you part of it, whether you intended it or not." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he had not experienced in years. Belonging, purpose, a reason to stay in one place instead of drifting from job to job across the territory. "I do not know how to be part of anything," he admitted. "I have been alone for a long time. Being alone is a choice," Ayanna said. "So is being part of something larger." The fire continued burning in the distance, but it no longer threatened their small piece of the world. Around them, the village settled into evening rhythms that had been unchanged for generations. Thomas McKenna had come to this canyon to find an ally in his fight against the mining company. Instead, he had found something he had never expected, a home worth defending. And perhaps, if he proved worthy of the trust placed in him, something even more precious. The woman who had refused to speak to any white man had not only broken her vow to save her people. She had opened a door to possibilities that neither of them had imagined that morning. The smoke should not have been there, but because it was, everything had changed. As the stars emerged above the canyon, Thomas understood that the real battle was just beginning. But for the first time in 20 years, he was not facing it alone. The fire that was meant to destroy had instead forged something new, something stronger than either of them could have built alone. Something worth fighting for.